This is my true story. I gave everything to my son, my years, my strength, my wealth, my name. I thought he would honor me in my old age, but instead he turned me into a spectacle. One afternoon, he tied a rope to the chair I sat on and dragged me across the yard like I was nothing. Neighbors stood and watched while my dignity was torn away. That day broke me, but it also woke me. He forgot that the future he counted on still rested in my hands. Before I show you what I did, tell me where you're watching from and please subscribe. My life was never easy. I came from nothing, and I knew the sting of hunger, the shame of poverty, and the weight of working with hands that never rested. But through every hardship, I carried one dream inside me, that my son would never live the life I lived. From the day he was born, I made him my purpose. I worked in the fields when the sun burned my skin. I worked in factories when the noise deafened my ears. I worked in cold winters when my bones ached so badly I could barely stand. Every coin I earned, every bit of energy I had, went to him. I wanted him to walk proudly in this world, never bowing his head in shame like I once had to. I built a name for myself the hard way. Slowly, over decades, I rose from the dirt of struggle to a place where people knew me as a man of honesty and perseverance. I saved enough to buy land. I built houses that would stand long after my hands were gone. I made investments, not for myself, but for the boy I loved more than life. Every document, every registry, every piece of wealth I gathered was meant to secure his future. I did not think of myself. I thought only of the son who would carry the family forward. When he was young, I carried him on my shoulders so his small feet would not touch the mud. When he grew older, I carried him in other ways, paying for his school, buying his books, clothing him in dignity. I never wanted him to feel lesser than others. When he married, I helped him stand proudly in front of his new family, supporting him financially and socially. I gave him everything I had, piece by piece, as if my life's purpose was only to make his easier. I believed in him more than I believed in myself. Every night, when I lay down exhausted, I reminded myself that the struggle was worth it, because one day my son would not have to live like I did. One day, he would inherit everything I built, the land, the houses, the savings, the reputation. That thought gave me strength when my body wanted to give up. I told myself again and again, it is for him, for his future, for his children. Sacrifice became my way of life. I denied myself comfort so he could live in comfort. I denied myself rest so he could rest without worry. I denied myself joy so he could smile without sadness. My body broke down under years of labor, but I thought it was a small price to pay if my son never had to taste the bitterness of struggle. And through all of it, I believed that love and respect would flow back to me in my old age. I believed that when I became weak, he would become my strength. When I grew frail, he would become my arms. When I became tired, he would become my rest. That was my dream as a father. That was the meaning behind every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, every sacrifice I made. I thought I was building not just wealth, but loyalty. I thought I was planting seeds that would bloom into respect and love. I thought my son would one day look at me with gratitude, remembering the years when I carried him, fed him, clothed him, and gave him more than I ever had. But I was wrong. At first, I ignored the small changes. I told myself my son was just busy, just tired, just stressed with his own life. But deep inside, I could feel the warmth fading. The boy who once ran into my arms after school, who once clung to my hand with trust, was no longer the same. He grew distant. His words became sharper. His eyes no longer carried the same respect. Slowly, without warning, the bond I had built with sacrifice began to crumble. It started with impatience. If I walked too slowly, he sighed. If I repeated myself, forgetting I had already spoken, he rolled his eyes. If my hands trembled and I dropped something, he laughed. These were small things, but they cut deep because they showed me the truth. He no longer saw me as his father. He saw me as a burden. At family gatherings, when others were present, he turned me into a joke. He mocked my frailty, telling stories about my mistakes. imitating the way I walked. People laughed, thinking it was harmless, but I sat there quietly, feeling smaller each time. I endured it. I told myself this was only a phase. I reminded myself of the years I had sacrificed for him, believing that deep down he still loved me, even if his actions said otherwise. I thought patience would soften him, that time would remind him of everything I had done. But instead, his cruelty grew. The more I stayed silent, the bolder he became. At home, the respect was gone completely. He spoke to me not with kindness, but with irritation. When I asked for help, he acted as if I was an inconvenience. When I tried to give advice, he brushed me aside, saying I was too old to understand. Slowly, my words carried no weight, my presence no meaning. I became invisible in the very house I had built with my hands. What hurt most was the way he taught others to treat me. His children, my grandchildren, watched his behavior and copied it. When he laughed at me, they laughed too. When he mocked my weakness, they repeated it. They did not know better, they only followed the example of their father. But it tore me apart to see the next generation, the children I loved, begin to treat me with the same disrespect. My sacrifices had created not gratitude, but arrogance. I remembered the nights I had gone without food so he could eat, the mornings I woke early to prepare him for school, the years I had worked double shifts to pay for his future. I remembered carrying him when his legs were too tired, shielding him from the rain with my own body, defending him when others mocked him as a child. All of that felt erased in a single glance of disrespect. He no longer introduced me with pride. When people asked about me, he spoke as though I was only an old man taking up space. He stopped calling me father with love. The word turned into something cold, something heavy, as if he carried shame by being linked to me. The respect that once lived between us was gone, replaced with scorn. The first signs of cruelty were not loud. They were quiet, like drops of water wearing down stone. Each laugh, each sigh, each dismissal chipped away at me until I felt hollow. I told myself to be patient, to forgive, to endure. I thought love would return, but love did not return. Each day, I saw more clearly that my son no longer saw me as the man who gave him everything. He saw me as nothing. And deep inside, though I stayed silent, I knew the truth. This was only the beginning. If he could strip me of respect in words, then one day he would strip me of dignity in action. And when that day came, it would be the day that changed everything. The day of my deepest humiliation came suddenly, but it had been building for years. His impatience, his laughter, his mockery, they were all signs of what was to come. Yet even with all those warnings, I was not ready for the cruelty that unfolded. It was an afternoon like any other. The air outside was still. Neighbors stood in their yards, and children played not far away. I sat in my chair in the yard, my body tired, but my heart still hoping that one day my son would remember who I was to him. Instead, that was the day he broke me. He walked toward me with a rope in his hand. At first, I thought it was for some chore, some work he wanted done. But his eyes told me otherwise. Without hesitation, he wrapped the rope around the legs of the chair where I sat. His movements were quick, harsh, and filled with mockery. I was too frail to resist, too stunned to even speak. Before I could process what he was doing, he tied the other end of the rope to something stronger, and with a pull, the chair lurched forward. My body jolted, my frail bones shaking with the sudden force. He dragged me across the yard, the chair scraping against the ground, my dignity shattering with every pull. The neighbors turned their heads. Some gasped. Some laughed nervously, unsure if it was a cruel joke or a game. But for me, it was no game. It was humiliation in its purest form. My son laughed as he pulled, mocking me as if I were a weight to be dragged, not a father to be honored. Each scrape of the chair across the dirt tore into my heart. I remembered when I used to carry him on my shoulders, careful not to let him fall, careful not to let him feel even a pebble under his small feet. I remembered when his laughter once filled me with pride, when it was the sound that gave me strength to keep working through my own exhaustion. But now, his laughter was poison. It was sharp, cruel, and filled with arrogance. It pierced me deeper than any blade. My body bruised as the chair bounced across uneven ground. My back ached, my arms shook, my head hung low. I wanted to cry out, but my pride kept me silent. I would not give him the satisfaction of hearing my pain. Still, the pain was there, in my body, in my heart, in my soul. The neighbors watched, their whispers surrounding me like a cage. Some pitied me, some judged me, but none stepped forward. I was alone, dragged by the very child I had once protected. When he finally stopped, the rope slackened, and I sat there in silence. My son stood tall, laughing, proud of what he had done. To him, it was entertainment. To me, it was betrayal beyond measure. He had not just dragged me across the yard. He had dragged my dignity through the dirt, in front of eyes that would never forget what they saw. That act broke something inside me. The respect between father and son was gone, erased in an afternoon. He had turned me into a spectacle, into an object of ridicule. And as I sat there, bruised and humiliated, I realized the truth. There was no forgiveness for this. This was not a mistake, not a lapse of judgment. This was cruelty chosen and displayed proudly. The boy I had raised, the man I had given everything to, had turned into someone I no longer recognized. The rope was not just tied to the chair. It was tied to my heart, dragging it across the dirt, leaving it torn and broken. That day, something inside me changed forever. I was no longer just a father enduring disrespect. I was a man stripped of all illusions, forced to face the truth. My love had been betrayed, my sacrifices forgotten, my dignity erased. And as much as it hurt, I knew this humiliation would not be the end. Because though he had tied me to that rope, he had forgotten something important. The power of a father does not vanish with age. When the rope was finally untied and the chair stood still again, I did not rise. I stayed seated, broken not only in body but in spirit. My skin carried bruises, my bones throbbed with pain, but it was my heart that hurt most. Around me, the sound of laughter still echoed, faint but sharp enough to pierce me again and again. My son's voice rose above it, laughing as though nothing shameful had happened. To him, it was amusement. To me, it was destruction. I looked down at my hands resting on my knees, the same hands that once carried him through childhood. I remembered how many times I had lifted him when he fell, how many times I carried him in my arms when his small legs grew tired. I remembered shielding him from storms, pulling blankets over him on cold nights, and whispering to him that he was safe because his father was there. Now those same arms hung useless at my sides, as the boy I had once protected turned into the man who dragged me across the dirt. The neighbors began to disperse, but their eyes stayed heavy on me. Some pitied me, some judged me, some shook their heads in disbelief. But none of them would forget what they had seen. Their whispers filled the air like smoke. The old man, dragged by his own son. Those words would spread, carried from one mouth to another, until my humiliation became a story told behind closed doors. That cut deeper than the bruises. Pain fades, but shame lingers. I sat there in silence, my head bowed. I did not speak, I did not cry, I did not fight. My silence was not because I accepted what had happened, but because I could not find words to match the depth of betrayal I felt. Inside me, memories flooded. His first steps, his first words, the day he started school, the day I gave him his first gift, the day I blessed his marriage. Each memory once brought pride. Now each memory stabbed me with the cruel truth. All my love, all my sacrifices, all my years of labor had ended here, with a rope dragging me across the yard. Night fell, but the humiliation did not leave me. I tried to rest, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the chair jerking beneath me again, heard the laughter of neighbors, saw the look of mockery in my son's eyes. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and I realized the pain I felt that day would not heal quickly. It would live with me. It would sit in my chest as a reminder that love can turn into cruelty, that sacrifice can be forgotten, that dignity can be stolen in moments. But as I sat in silence, something else began to grow beneath the shame. At first it was faint, like a whisper I could barely hear. Then it grew louder, clearer. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was something sharper, resolve. My humiliation had stripped away every illusion I once held about my son. I no longer believed he would change, no longer believed respect would return. I saw the truth clearly for the first time. He did not love me, he did not respect me, he never would, and because of that, I owed him nothing. Silent humiliation has a strange power. It can break a man, or it can transform him. That day, it transformed me. My tears dried, my shame hardened into strength. I was still silent on the outside, but inside, my decision was beginning to take shape. My son thought dragging me proved I was powerless. He thought I would sit forever as the useless old man he imagined me to be. But he forgot that the man he humiliated was the same man who still held his future. He forgot that the father he mocked was the one whose name still carried authority over every deed, every property, every registry. That night, in the silence of my humiliation, I began to understand something important. I may have been dragged across the yard, but I was not done. He tied me to a rope, but I still held the pen that could cut him off from everything he thought was his. He laughed at me in front of neighbors, but I would have the last silence, not through words, not through shouts, but through action. My humiliation planted the seed of justice. My son believed he had broken me completely. He believed the rope, the chair, and the laughter had erased all of my worth. He thought I was nothing but an old man waiting for the end, with no voice, no strength, and no power. He mocked me as if my life had no meaning left. He paraded me like a trophy of humiliation, thinking his cruelty would be the final chapter of my story. But what he did not understand, what he had forgotten, was that true power does not lie in muscle or youth. True power lies in the name on the papers, the control of the legacy, the authority over the inheritance. And all of that still belonged to me. The house he lived in, the land he walked on, the property he boasted about to others. None of it was his. The accounts he counted as his future, the fortune he imagined, the registry he believed had sealed his destiny, all of it still carried my name. My age may have weakened my body, but it had not erased the ink on those documents. It had not erased my rights as the owner. It had not erased my authority as the man who built it all. For years, I had worked myself to the bone, creating a life that he could inherit. I had saved, invested, and signed papers that secured everything under my control. I had always assumed that when my time came, I would pass it all on to him without question. I thought that was what fathers were meant to do, but he mistook that assumption as a guarantee. He forgot that inheritance is not a right, but a gift, and gifts can be taken back when they are not respected. I sat in silence after the humiliation, remembering every detail of my life's work. The registry was mine. The deeds were mine. The accounts were mine. Even the smallest piece of land still bore my name. My son had forgotten this because he thought old age meant weakness. He thought cruelty meant victory. He believed dragging me across the yard had stripped me of all control. But in truth, it only awakened me to the fact that my control was stronger than ever. The power of a father does not end when his body grows frail. It does not end when his steps slow or when his hair turns white. The power of a father lives in the sacrifices he made, the wealth he built, the legacy he controls. And I still held that legacy. With a single signature, I could erase his future. With a single decision, I could take away everything he thought was his destiny. He had forgotten that fact, but I had not. As I thought about it, I realized something else. The humiliation he gave me in public was loud and cruel, but the justice I could give him would be quiet and final. He had tied me to a rope, thinking it proved his dominance. But I held the rope of his life, tied not to a chair, but to his future. And unlike him, I did not need to drag it. I only needed to cut it. That realization gave me strength. For the first time since the humiliation, I lifted my head. I was not powerless. I was not broken. I was not the useless old man he wanted me to believe I was. I was still the man whose name carried weight in every legal record. I was still the man whose decision determined the future of the family. And now, after what he had done, I knew exactly how I would use that power. He thought the rope had tied me down. He was wrong. The rope had freed me from illusion. I no longer believed he deserved my sacrifices. I no longer believed he was worthy of the inheritance. My humiliation had cleared my sight. I could now see the truth. My power was not gone, and it was time to use it. That night, as I sat alone in the silence of my room, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. My body still ached from being dragged across the yard, my skin still burned from the bruises, and my heart still carried the sting of humiliation. But beneath the pain, something had changed. My tears had dried. My shame had hardened into clarity. For the first time, I saw the truth with no illusions. My son was not the boy I once carried in my arms. He was not the man I had dreamed he would be. He was a stranger who wore my blood but had lost my respect. And because of that, I owed him nothing. I thought back to the decades of sacrifice I had given, the years of work, the nights without rest, the food I skipped so he could eat, the clothes I went without so he could have dignity. Every moment of my life had been shaped by love for him. But love cannot survive where there is cruelty. Love cannot survive where there is humiliation. And his act, tying me to a rope and dragging me like an object, had killed whatever bond remained between us. That was not the act of a son. That was the act of a man who had forgotten the meaning of family, of respect, of humanity itself. I sat in the dark, listening to the sound of my breath, and I asked myself one question: how do I respond? Do I stay silent, enduring humiliation until the end of my days? Do I forgive, only to be mocked again? Or do I rise, not with anger, but with the strength of the authority still in my hands? The answer became clear. Enough was enough. The line had been crossed, and it could never be repaired. My son had cut himself off from my love, and now I would cut him off from my legacy. It was not an easy thought. A father does not easily decide to erase his son from his future, but cruelty makes choices clearer. I realized that my inheritance, my properties, my wealth, my name, all of it, was too precious to be given to someone who had dragged me through the dirt. If I left it in his hands, it would be a reward for his cruelty. And I could not allow that. A father's legacy is not just money, it is honor. It is the final proof of a life's work. And I would not let my legacy rest in the hands of a man who stripped me of dignity. So that night, I made my decision. I would go to the lawyer. I would remove his name from every registry, every deed, every will. I would erase him completely from the inheritance he thought was guaranteed. He tied me to a rope, but I would untie him from my future. He dragged me across the yard, but I would drag his name out of the documents that promised him wealth. My silence would become action, and my humiliation would become justice. The decision gave me peace. For the first time in years, I slept without fear. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow, I would act. Tomorrow, I would cut the rope that bound me to him. Tomorrow, I would write the final truth: that respect matters more than blood, and dignity matters more than inheritance. The next morning, I rose with a clear purpose. My body was still sore, the bruises still fresh, but inside me, I carried a strength that pain could not erase. I dressed slowly, steadying myself with each movement, then walked out of the house without a word. My son did not ask where I was going. He did not care. He thought I had no power left to change anything. But as I stepped into the quiet streets, I knew the truth. I carried more power than he could ever imagine. I made my way to my lawyer's office. The walk felt long, but every step reminded me of why I was doing this. With each stride, I thought of the rope, the laughter, the shame. With each breath, I remembered the years of sacrifice he had spat on. By the time I reached the door, I no longer felt weak. I felt steady, determined, ready. The lawyer greeted me with surprise, seeing the bruises on my skin, the exhaustion in my eyes. I sat down slowly and told him everything. I spoke of the humiliation, of being tied to a chair, dragged across the yard like an animal, laughed at by neighbors while my dignity was ripped away. My voice did not shake. I was calm, because my decision had already been made. I looked him in the eye and told him I wanted my son erased. Not from my life, because that had already happened, but from the future he thought was his. From the inheritance, from the registry, from everything I owned. He listened carefully, then began to pull out the papers. The documents that once carried my son's name now lay open in front of me. One by one, we amended them. We struck his name off deeds, removed it from accounts, erased it from registries. My hand trembled slightly as I signed, but it was not weakness. It was the weight of justice. Each signature was a cut to the rope he once tied around me. Each line I signed was a strike against his cruelty. We rewrote the will completely. My son was no longer a part of it. Every property, every piece of land, every account, every part of my wealth was secured away from him. The lawyer guided me, ensuring the law sealed every change. There would be no loopholes, no chance for him to claim later what he had already lost. When the last paper was signed, it was done. Legally, fully, completely. My son no longer existed in the future I built. I leaned back in the chair and felt a wave of relief wash over me. My humiliation had been turned into power. My suffering had been turned into justice. The man who once dragged me across the yard now had no claim to the legacy he mocked. He thought cruelty was power. But true power was this: quiet, decisive, written in ink that could never be undone. When I left the office, the world looked different. The sun seemed brighter, the air lighter. My steps were slow, but they were steady with dignity. I no longer felt like the useless old man he believed me to be. I felt like a man who had taken back control. My silence had not been weakness. It had been patience, waiting for the right moment to act. And now that I had acted, the balance had shifted forever. That day, I returned home without fear. My son still laughed, still mocked, still believed the future was his. But I looked at him with different eyes. He no longer held power over me. I held power over him. He did not know it yet, but his name had been erased. His future was gone, and when the day came for him to reach for what he thought was his, he would find only emptiness. That was the execution of my decision. Silent, final, and complete. It did not take long for the truth to surface. At first, my son walked with arrogance, still believing the world was under his feet. He carried himself as though the fortune was his, as though the inheritance was already resting in his hands. He boasted to others, spoke with confidence, and treated me like a shadow in my own home. But arrogance has a way of meeting reality, and when it does, it shatters louder than any rope scraping across the ground. The day came when he tried to act as the master of what he thought was his. He spoke of selling land, of borrowing against property, of using wealth that was never truly in his name. He walked into places with his chest puffed, thinking the bloodline alone gave him authority. But then came the silence of confusion when officials told him his name was nowhere in the registry. The silence of disbelief when banks told him he had no legal claim. The silence of shock when lawyers explained that the inheritance he thought was guaranteed had been cut away. He stormed home in a rage, demanding answers. His voice roared, but his power was gone. He searched through documents, through papers, through anything he could lay his hands on. But what he found was the truth. His name had been erased. Where he once expected to see his signature, there was none. Where he thought his future rested, there was nothing. The rope he once tied around me had looped back onto him, strangling the destiny he thought belonged to him. I watched quietly as his anger turned into desperation. He shouted, he cursed, he accused. But every word was hollow. No matter how loud he became, the truth did not change. The house was not his. The land was not his. The money was not his. Everything he believed was his birthright had slipped through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Neighbors soon learned of his downfall. The same people who once saw him drag me across the yard now saw him dragged down by his own arrogance. Whispers filled the streets again, but this time the shame was his. They spoke of the man who mocked his father and was left with nothing. They shook their heads, saying the old man had been stronger than he appeared. They pitied me no longer. They pitied him. The fallout spread like fire. His wife grew restless, angry at the reality of a future without inheritance. His friends who once laughed with him began to step away, no longer impressed by his false pride. The community that once watched him parade his cruelty now watched him collapse under the weight of his own actions. His name became a warning, a reminder that arrogance against one's own blood comes at a cost. And through it all, I stayed silent. I did not shout, I did not argue, I did not defend myself. I did not need to. My justice was already written in ink. The humiliation he gave me was public, loud, and cruel. But the justice I gave him was silent, legal, and permanent. That was the fallout, his rage against the walls, his screams against the silence, his despair against the unchangeable truth. For the first time in years, I felt a calm settle over me. The man who had dragged me like a worthless object was now dragged by reality itself. His rope had turned back on him, and I no longer carried the weight of shame. I carried only peace. After the papers were signed and his name erased, life changed forever in that house. The air felt different. The silence was heavier, not with my humiliation anymore, but with his defeat. Every corner that once carried his laughter now echoed with his frustration. Every step he took seemed restless, uncertain, as if the ground beneath him had turned fragile. He had built his arrogance on the belief that his future was secure, but now that foundation had crumbled. He walked around like a man lost, stripped of the power he thought he had. Relatives soon heard of what had happened. They came with questions, some with shock, others with quiet approval. Many of them had seen the way he treated me, the way he mocked and humiliated me. They had shaken their heads in silence before, but now they spoke openly. They said he had brought this upon himself. They said no man who drags his father across a yard deserves to inherit what that father built. Their words carried weight in the community, and slowly the respect he once demanded from others turned into ridicule. People no longer saw him as the proud heir. They saw him as the man who lost everything because of his cruelty. The neighbors who once pitied me now looked at me with something different: respect. They saw me not as a weak old man who endured humiliation, but as someone who still carried strength, even in silence. They realized that the rope he tied around me had not bound me forever. It had only pushed me to act. And now, the act was complete. They whispered about justice, about how the old man had turned shame into power. Their glances no longer carried pity. They carried acknowledgement. Inside the house, the tension grew unbearable. His wife, who once looked at me with coldness, now looked at him with disappointment. She had married a man who promised her a secure future, but now she lived with someone who had thrown that future away. Arguments erupted behind closed doors. His voice, once filled with laughter, was now filled with anger and excuses. Her voice, once filled with expectation, was now filled with bitterness. The very roof he thought would protect his pride now sheltered only conflict and regret. I did not join their arguments. I did not raise my voice. I sat quietly, as I always had, but with a peace they could not touch. I no longer felt like a prisoner in my own home. I no longer felt like the man dragged across the dirt. I was free in a way they would never understand. Because while they fought over the emptiness of their lost inheritance, I carried the fullness of justice inside me. Time passed, and slowly, the family that once laughed at me began to break apart. Friends stopped visiting. Relatives kept their distance. The man who thought he was powerful stood alone, with nothing left to show but his anger. And the more he realized what he had lost, the more he understood the weight of his cruelty. His arrogance, his mockery, his rope, all of it had come back to crush him. For me, the aftermath was calm. I spent my days in peace, knowing that my decision was final. I had erased him from the future, and in doing so, I had erased the power he once had over me. I no longer feared his laughter. I no longer felt his humiliation. I lived quietly, carrying dignity in every breath. My life was not perfect, but it was mine. My legacy was secure, safe from the hands that tried to destroy me. That was the aftermath. For him, despair. For me, peace. For the world around us, a lesson. Cruelty may drag a man across the dirt, but justice will always rise, steady and unshaken in the end. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and final. That is how mine came. My son thought dragging me across the yard had ended me, but he did not see that it was only the beginning. The real end came later, when he discovered he no longer had a place in my legacy. That was my justice, not in shouting, not in fighting, but in erasing his future with the same calm hand that once built it for him. I lived my days after that with peace I had not felt in years. I no longer feared his mockery. I no longer felt the weight of his arrogance pressing me down. I no longer sat awake at night wondering if I was only a burden, because I knew now that I had taken back my dignity. I had chosen to protect what I built, not for him, but for myself and for those who would respect it. My legacy was no longer chained to cruelty. It was free, just as I was free. Grandpa's justice was not revenge and anger. It was balance restored. He tied me to a rope, but I untied him from my future. He dragged me across the dirt, but I dragged his name out of the registry. He thought humiliation was permanent, but I showed him that dignity can be reclaimed. His cruelty tried to bury me, but my decision buried his pride instead. I spent the rest of my years in quiet dignity. I walked through the village with my head held high, no longer the old man people pitied, but the man who had turned shame into strength. Neighbors greeted me with respect. Relatives who once looked away now looked at me with admiration. They saw not weakness, but justice. They saw not defeat, but victory. My silence had been mistaken for weakness, but it had been patience all along. And patience, when paired with truth, becomes the strongest form of power. As for my son, he lived in the shadow of what he had lost. He had no inheritance, no future built on my labor. He carried only the memory of the rope and the weight of his arrogance. His laughter, once loud, was gone. His pride, once tall, was broken. He stood in the same streets where he had once dragged me, but now he carried the shame. People whispered about him, not me. People judged him, not me. That was justice. And when I thought about it all, the sacrifice, the humiliation, the decision, and the execution, I felt no regret. A father owes his son love, but not when that love is turned into cruelty. A father owes his son guidance, but not when that guidance is mocked. A father owes his son a legacy, but not when that son has thrown dignity into the dirt. My justice was fair. My justice was final. So I lived my days with peace, knowing the truth. Respect matters more than blood. Dignity matters more than inheritance. And legacy belongs only to those who honor it. Final thought, he tied me to a rope. I untied him from my future, forever.